Bonjour, or hello, and welcome to day 16 of the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar. And French is the lingua franca today, as Sid is going to be telling us about how the politics of the French court have inspired his approach to life, probably, and certainly style.
Over these Advent calendars for 2021, Richard, Nick and myself have been talking about inspiration and the role that has in designing wargames rules and staging our tabletop miniature wargames. But what role does inspiration have in the design of miniature wargames campaigns? Campaigns are one of the most rewarding aspects of wargaming, but they're also one of the hardest things to get right. I've been working this autumn on a campaign system for With Flashing Blades, our game set in the world of the Three Musketeers and the novels of Alexandre Dumas. And that's a world which is also placed in historical France in the 1620s, which is a very different world. The more I've read through Dumas' novels and about Dumas himself, and wonderful though they are, they do seem to be a very different world to the historical one. So how do we marry up those two inspirations? On the one hand, the world of novels and films, on the other hand, the historical world, which, as historical wargamers, really infuses the games that we're playing. I think it's a really worthwhile exercise to do this. We are playing historical wargames, but we want to be inspired by something that we think is really fun and entertaining. So on the one hand, during the course of the summer, I read Three Musketeers and some of Dumas' other books, and also the books which are similar in genre, such as the Captain à la Triste novels. And in the Dumas novels, fights are actually very rare. Somewhat disappointingly, spoiler alert for a book written in the 1840s, in the Three Musketeers, one of the main fights takes place using muskets and pistols rather than swords. There's very little actual sword fighting, but there's tons and tons of intrigue with numerous plot lines and complex relationships between the characters. We're in the upper echelons of society. D'Artagnan's either present in the world of discussions with important characters, or we're in the world of the king, the queen, the cardinal, the Duke of Buckingham, various dukes and counts and duchesses. The actions of the musketeers are revolving around those characters, not the opposite. And Dumas loves place name dropping, and he describes Paris in a really detailed sort of manner, but one which is really perhaps more familiar to the 1840s than it ever would have been to the 1620s. Dumas places the king at the centre of everything, navigated around the various issues of the day by his Éminence grise, Cardinal Richelieu. It's a world where heroes have a dramatic and influential role out of all proportion to things like social standing or patronage or, importantly, wealth. It's a fun and a really classic book, but when I was reading it and the other books, the worlds of that novels seemed to be about breaking out of the restrictive class system of the characters and achieving things despite their background. By contrast, the world of 1620s was a very different and darker world. In Paris of the 1620s, characters would navigate an orbit of powerful and unassailable masters, dominated by patronage and the unpleasant things that money makes one do. Power revolved around the complex relationships of the king, the court, the nobility and the church. This was the world, the historical world, of factional rivalries, competing ambitions between powerful noble houses, and the relationship between the king and his advisors. It is a world in which, in some ways, and speaking in December 2021, looks unnervingly like our own, but there was a far harder, darker edge to the way that game of politics was being played. On the morning of the 24th of April 1617, about 10 o'clock, Concino Concini, royal favourite and chief minister of Louis XIII, was murdered in the courtyard of the Louvre. Concini was murdered by a group of powerful French nobles, many of them very young, and his body was stripped of valuables, including a large diamond ring, a scarf, in his black velvet cloak. Although buried in the church of Saint-Germain-de-l'Auxerrois, he was disinterred by the Paris mob, his body burnt and his ashes and bones thrown in the Seine. His wife, a childhood friend of the Queen Mother, was arrested on charge of witchcraft, beheaded and burned a few weeks later. I mention this as the group of young noblemen and their accomplices who committed Concini's murder are the real protagonists in the world of Dumas' novels. They included aggressive aristocrats, determined to imprint their arrival at court on the memories of those in positions of power. Their lackeys or henchmen included soldiers of fortune and adventurers from Germany or Scotland or Italy, hired for their ability to project intimidation and invulnerability. The swaggering braggadocio of these protagonists was announced by their earrings, outlandish haircuts, codpieces, ostentatious fashions, and artfully curled facial hair and moustaches. These men carried rapiers as marks of fashion and distinction, but the rapier wasn't just for show. It announced the wearer as a man of honour, and prepared to die fighting, if necessary, to prove it. These groups projected the impression of a section of society with its own rules, proud, quarrelsome, jealous, determined, ambitious. Men such as this were available to support and augment the ambitions of wealthy patrons. They would navigate around the orbit of powerful, leading houses of French nobility, and would sometimes, as with Concini's murder, be asked to undertake actions of brutality and bloodshed. These actors on the stage of 1620s Paris were in many ways a tribe with their own rules, expected behaviour, and obligation to patrons and masters, nobles and notable personages. They were tied by blood and family and patronage, and once in the service of a noble house, prince or royal master, they were bound by honour to deliver that service. The world of these protagonists was not the world of a strong central monarchy or state attempting to canalise or control violence through ritual duels. The duels taking place between these aristocratic and ambitious young nobles and their henchmen was not some form of domesticity of French nobility, as sometimes it's been argued. Far from it. I think the inclination to duel and the resorting to violence at times, like with Concini's murder, was part of a wider system of vindicatory violence and the concept of noble feud. By contrast, looking back to Dumas' world, it seems familiar, fun, almost comfortable, but it's a strange world which seems to have more in common with the 1840s than the brutal feral nature of French court politics in the 1620s. I mention all this because sometimes when we look at our inspiration, it doesn't come alone. We can augment and supplant and even replace our original inspiration by something which is perhaps more interesting. What I hope we've ended up with in our system for the campaigns of With Flashing Blades is something which is perhaps both true to the myth, but also the reality of 1620s France, a world which, to the casual eye, has all the arabesque entertainment and humour of Dumas' world of novels and films, but it's also a world in which, as the campaigns are navigated through, might just give an insight into the brutality, violence and motivation of the historical counterparts represented on the tabletop.